tongue ties, jaw structure, nutrition, and pelvic anatomy. I want to take some time to talk about this because I get a lot of questions. If you don't know anything about this topic, then welcome to the topic of just jaw-mouth structure. But I think it's really interesting, and I want to talk about it in relationship to pelvic health and pelvic anatomy. So if you are not aware that our jaws and our tongues and our soft palate and everything sort of in our head, neck, and skull, that they develop largely not just in utero, but then in the first year of life through different biomechanical and nutritional inputs. So the work of Dr. Weston A. Price, who's actually a dentist, is something that's really worth looking into. If you're not familiar, I suggest doing a little research there. But what I do think is more commonly known, especially if you're in my audience, has to do with a restricted jaw development that can happen in correlation with lip and tongue ties. So I myself had a tongue tie that was quite significant, and I had all of these dental issues as a kid, all these orthodontic issues. I was my mother's fourth child, so maybe didn't have the most mineral rich, gestation and early childhood years. But nonetheless, my tongue tie was quite significant, and I actually had it revised in adulthood, and I have been doing all sorts of different therapeutics and rehabilitation for the muscular system, the fascial system, and also just the bones and the structural anatomy of my mouth and jaw. What I also think is incredibly remarkable, if we're looking, and I think we're talking consistently about how a jaw being narrowed, right? So the lack of the ability of the tongue to consistently rest on the soft palate, the breast being drawn deeply into the mouth of a newborn baby and spending significant amount of times there. Maybe a shout out to you breastfeeding moms who are feeding 12 or more hours a day, right? That pressure on the soft palate serves to widen the jaw. But what we also see, and we talk about all the time, is the correlation between jaw structure and pelvic structure, like, TMJ and tight hips, or stuff like that, just that kind of overall connection. Or we see fascial restriction in the mouth correlated to fascial restriction in the pelvic bowl. However, what I also want to offer is my observation when I'm looking at the development of wide, broad palates. We also see that largely developing along with wider, broader pelvic bones. So as we've been looking at sort of people historically, and again, you can look at documentation from the Weston A. Price Society if you do want to see photos on this, but we are seeing the sort of narrowing of the jaw and palate, but we've also seen specifically in women the narrowing of the hips and pelvis. And I think this is incredibly important because, as you all know, I'm really into the biomechanics and I attend births, right? But just biomechanics of human life. And if we're wondering, why is it so much harder for women to give birth now? Is that even true? Like, why do we have such greater complication rates? And while I absolutely think that all babies come out, and if you can get pregnant, then you can totally birth your baby through your pelvis. I'm not here saying that there is a, too small pelvis to birth a baby. That's not, what I'm remarking on. But what I am noticing is that we do have a narrowing of the size of the pelvic bones that we often see correlated with a narrowing of the jaw over time. And while this by no means, as I said, that you can't birth your baby, I do think it has other biomechanical implications, meaning we often see more SI joint instability with relatively narrow pelvises. We also see it can be harder to develop more gluteal flesh if you have, just like a smaller frame and less muscle hanging on that bone. So I just want to be bringing our attention to this because so often when we're thinking about those of you who are, in the Weston A. Price or in the sort of nourishing traditions or, whole food, raw milk, bone broth, collagen like vibe in terms of your nutrition and your approach to maybe mothering or child rearing, we are thinking so much about oral health and breastfeeding health, but we're not generally thinking about pelvic health and how it all relates. Yet we're so often being like, oh yeah, the jaw and the pelvis, they're related, but they're related in this circumstance as well. So just as much as you're, interested in having these nutritional and lifestyle approaches for, overall oral health and knowing that that affects everything in health, right? The same is true for our pelvic health and longevity. So I just want to be thinking about this, and my dream as I've, hoping to talk to Sally Fallon, who she also obviously does a ton of work in this area. If you're not familiar with her, give her a Google. She's amazing. She runs the Weston A. Price Society. and specifically looking at the bony and the pelvic structural changes that are being seen over time and what we can be doing to support them from a holistic and integrated perspective. So that's one. The next thing I want to say is that if you are someone who does struggle with any of the oral restriction, so like myself, I had the really significant tongue tie. I certainly couldn't suction my tongue to the roof of my mouth. It's often one of the first things that I assess when I see women in my practice for any type of structural pelvic health dysfunction. So I'm like, well, what does your oral function look like? And often we would address oral function and oral tongue posture and breathing mechanics as a primary way to be or, you know, as just an initial piece of the puzzle, maybe, when we're looking at bettering our overall pelvic biomechanics and pelvic function. So if you are a woman who knows that you have a tie, or knows that you have restrictions in the mouth, or knows that you have TMJ, and you're wondering if it's related to what's going on in your pelvis, I'm here to say I personally think it is. And I think it is in a way that is far more direct than we maybe have even considered before. In that the jaw and the jaw is the sort of pelvis of the head, so to speak, and then the pelvis is obviously the primary stabilizing structure in the body, right? And so when we have these two major bony structures that maybe have similar and potentially suboptimal bony development and alignment due to a variety of factors, we might see similar restriction. I'm just also musing about, restriction in the ovaries, right? And maybe thinking about ovarian cysts or even endometriosis potentially, and as well as restriction in the thyroid or growths on the thyroid. I often think about the thyroid as the third ovary, right? And its role that it plays in our female endocrine system, and what is going to be potentially affecting that from a structural level. I think it's also very related to what's happening in the pelvis. So I just want us to be thinking about this in terms of what our bony development, our nutrition, and our structure. This is obviously what I'm interested in my work, but how, maybe we can extend that beyond just why breastfeeding is great for mouth and skull development, or, nutritional foods or having tongue ties or lip ties or buccal ties revised in childhood or adulthood is great for, better, head, neck function and skull plates and all of that, but also seeing it as a more integrated way to be looking at our whole body. So if you're interested, I have a lot more to say about this topic. I'm going to be having some upcoming webinars about this. I'm going to be meeting with another midwife, an incredible prenatal and postpartum body worker to do a webinar. I'm also meeting with Dr. Heidi Aronson, and we'll be doing a really long format deep dive. She's a pediatric and adult dentist, biological dentist, who also does a bunch of revisions and therapies in both children and adults. And so I'm really into this topic. So if you are to, definitely stay tuned for these upcoming teachings and deep dives that are coming in 2023. All right, if you do have any thoughts or just any personal experience with this, definitely drop a comment below, or you can email me back. And we'll talk soon.